It's TheOpenSight here, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about different trigger types and different methods that firearms use to fire bullets. And what I'm talking about here is single action or double action triggers, or striker fired or hammer fired. Okay. My first example is going to be kind of a hybrid of double action. It's not really the perfect example of a double action because it isn't a true double action. Hopefully I'll explain the difference. But it's the best example I have, and that's going to be the Ruger LCP. Okay. Now, just to give you some basics, the difference between a single action and a double action trigger is simply that a single action trigger, the firearm needs to be, the hammer on the firearm, or even the striker on the firearm, needs to be cocked and in position, ready to fire. Basically spring loaded, pulled back on the weight of a spring, ready to slam forward into the back of a casing, into the primer of a casing. It has to be ready in that position for the trigger to work. And then the trigger is just like it's like a mouse trap, just the slightest touch, not really that sensitive, I shouldn't say the slightest touch, but with if it's a good trigger, hopefully it has a nice crisp, clean break. And when I say a crisp break, I mean that the trigger shouldn't have any movement in it until bam, and let's go with the hammer. Okay, so when you pull the trigger, it's like stiff, psh, then it moves, gun has gone off. That's a good crisp trigger. Okay, and that's a single action. A double action would be like this LCP here, where you pull the trigger, and as you're pulling this trigger, it's cocking the hammer. So it's a double action because it's performing two functions. One function is it's going to release the hammer. The other function is it's cocking the hammer, so you don't have to cock the hammer. This LCP is a bit of a hybrid, and the reason that is, when you cock this gun and it's unloaded, okay, when you cock this gun is now cocked. If it was a single action, all I would have to do, move the trigger like that, this gun would have went off. But this isn't a single action. This is kind of a hybrid. It's more of a double action. So when I pull this back, you're going to see, pulling this back under weight. I'm trying to do it slowly to demonstrate. The hammer in the back is actually cocking. See that hammer? See that hammer? See that hammer move? That is a double action. And then when I pull the trigger all the way back, bam, just went off. If there was bullets in this gun, it would have went off. So now the hammer's not cocked. So that's a double action. Cocks and fires the hammer. Cocks and releases. Okay, there it is being cocked now. I'm doing this left-handed. See that? Double action. Okay. Now, the second thing I'm talking about is single action. In this video, I'm going to use all firearms that you've already seen featured in my videos. So along that line, I bring you this guy. Remember this classic guy from maybe the first video I made? This has a single action trigger. It's not semi-automatic. It's pump operated. Pump operated means I have to work this pump to cock the gun. This is the action that cocks this gun. Okay? Now, this trigger is single action. So what does that mean? It's not the best trigger in the world, so it's not going to be super crisp or anything like it's supposed to be. But you'll get the idea. We just cocked it a bunch of times, but I don't feel good unless I look down the actual chamber. Okay, so here we go. Now this trigger has a tiny bit of creep. See that? Creeps just a little bit of take up there. Okay, so I get it in position. Now it's single action. See that? There was no cocking of any hammers. I'm cocking the hammer right now. I just cocked the hammer. Now the hammer's cocked. Okay? All this trigger is doing is releasing the hammer. Single action. Okay. That's single action. Single action makes for a much shorter trigger break. A lot of people prefer it for that reason. Then again, for carry, a lot of people don't prefer it for that reason, because if you have, now that trigger is kind of sensitive. You can bump that trigger into something, say a table, if you don't have a safety on and it's loaded and ready to go, then that trigger will go off, you know, if you bump the trigger. Now back to this LCP. This trigger, on the other hand, you're not bumping this on any table and it's going off. I mean, it's long, you know, the trigger, I've never measured it, but it probably travels an inch. Here goes some of that take up. Okay, see that? So this trigger has a lot of take up in it. I don't hate this trigger, you know. At first I kind of didn't like it, but it kind of grew on me. It's a little heavy. This trigger's a little heavy, but for a carry gun, I kind of like heavy. I mean, not so heavy to where, you know, I can't barely pull it. Maybe if I had weak hands, this would be a problem. This one isn't that heavy. But it's heavy enough. I wouldn't want it any heavier. Let's put it that way. So then you start pulling it. It's very long. If you're bumping it on the table this hard, you're already fighting with somebody or something. Okay. So I see that all that movement you have in there. So this would be a lot, without a safety on. It would be a lot harder to get this gun to go off on accident. So a lot of people prefer double action for that reason. You would have to really screw up to have this gun go off on accident. I mean, this trigger has to travel all this way, and from here on, from this position on, under a good amount of weight. Okay. That brings me to the final and different. This is a safe action trigger. Now, in mechanical function, this trigger is much more like a single action trigger, in that this gun is basically cocked. I think they kind of compare it to this style, where cocking the gun cocks the hammer. And I don't know if I showed that, but when you cock the gun, when you rack the slide on this gun, the hammer is, let's see if I can get that lined up, totally forward right now, and the trigger is dead. Okay, when you cock it, now the hammer is partially cocked. That's why it's a hybrid. You know, it's a mix between a single and a double action trigger. You know, and then now the trigger is no longer dead. Now the trigger is in control of the hammer, and from this point forward, this gun is essentially a double action gun, even though it's partially cocked. A true double action would start off in this position. Essentially, it would always be in this position, like a revolver, and every time you pulled the trigger, the gun would go off if it was loaded. Okay, which brings me to safe action. Safe action is different. As far as I know, it started with Glock, but there was possibly some before this, I don't know. It has a safety tang in here. It is nothing more than just a plastic tab, and you can see the back of it here. When you press the little tab, the back of it moves out of the way. There's no cutout for it on the back of it, and it allows the trigger to move forward. I'm going to safety check this one more time before I actually do it. Okay. Now, this here might look like take up or creep, just like in the LCP trigger, but actually it's a little different. What's happening right now is all the safeties are essentially being disengaged. That's the firing pin safety, the drop safety, and the trigger safety I just showed you. There's a little pin indent in the slide that gets pushed in, frees up the firing pin, and that allows the firing pin to come into contact with the primer on the cartridge. Okay. But once you're in this position, this is essentially, I think that they claim that the gun is just only partially cocked. and then when in this first stage you're also cocking the gun somewhat. I don't know about that, but I have read that. But from this point on, this is basically a single action trigger. Okay, so you know it will have a crisp, clean break. Hear that snap? Now this is trigger reset. Hear that click? That was the trigger resetting. Clocks are awesome in that sense. Look at the minimal travel. Reset. This is essentially single action now. If this was loaded, the bullet would have just went off. It would have pulled back the slide. The slide would have came back under the pressure of the spring, and it'd be cocked again. This trigger is essentially single action, even though it's also somewhat of a hybrid because it has the safe action features, which disengages the safeties. Mechanically, it's very similar to a single action. A hammer is simply, just like a hammer or a tool. It's something that strikes the firing pin. It's loaded up, it's cocked back, loaded under the weight of a spring, waiting to be released by the trigger and sear. And then once it's released, it hammers into the back of the firing pin, which the firing pin is usually in its own little channel, which is like a tube that it fits in. And then it has a little room to slide back and forth. Sometimes they're pretty freely moving in there. Sometimes firing pins are loaded under the weight of a spring also. That keep them off of the back of a primer. That's a little bit of a safety feature. And the hammer comes and slaps into the exposed rear of the firing pin, which I will show you, and fires the gun. Okay. Difference between that and a striker fire. Well, striker fire is simple. Here's the Glock slide. We eliminate the hammer. Okay. Now here's the slide. The slide wouldn't have a hammer. The hammer would be here. But you see, there's no hammer. There's no hammer. The hammer would be right back here somewhere. Okay. No hammer. So here's the firing pin, the back of the firing pin. Okay. Let's see, maybe my finger's covering it up. It's weird on the angle. Let's see. There you go. There's the back of the firing pin, this little metal piece sticking out back here, this little shiny piece of metal. There's no hammer that strikes that. This firing pin is spring loaded. It's under the weight of a spring. It wants to constantly slam into the back of the primer. So that may sound like a dangerous feature. That's why you have to have this. This is that little pin I was telling you about that blocks the firing pin from getting to the cartridge. The firing pin cannot get to the primer. And I'll demonstrate that. Okay, I just pulled this little metal tab back. That one. Okay, that's attached. That's part of the firing pin, or in this case, the striker. So there's no hammer, so the firing pin is the striker. I just pulled this back, which allowed this little plunger up here. Can't see what I'm doing. This plunger up here. You can look in that video, I guess. Okay, that allowed that plunger to get in the way of this firing pin. So this firing pin cannot move forward anymore, and I'll show you that. If you look in there, you see the hole for the firing pin. There's the hole for the firing pin. Right now, I'm pushing on the back of that firing pin. Okay? That firing pin is not coming out. You see that? But if I just press this button here, this little round button, that firing pin will pop out of that hole. See it? It's like, there I am, there I am. That's what the first stage of that safe action trigger did. It allowed that firing pin to move forward. If I take my finger off that button, guess what? Don't come out anymore. Just show you I'm not tricking you. I move it there. It works. Take my finger off. Doesn't work anymore. Okay? So that's what a striker is. There's no hammer. Okay, it's just a spring-loaded firing pin. That's it. Don't be confused. Some guns that are fired with hammers have spring-loaded firing pins as well, but those springs push the firing pin away from the cartridge. A striker's spring pushes the firing pin towards the cartridge, and it's only the safeties and this little latch right here that gets caught onto the trigger that keep it from actually, going off on its own. That's the difference.